Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth lecture in our course series, The Stars of Paris. My name is Kristen Hoskins and I'm the curator of lectures, courses, and concerts. First of all, we want to thank Wilmington Trust, who is generously sponsoring this course. Today's lecture, The Dancing World of Toulouse Lautrec, will be presented by Isabel Keilson, a lecturer on social studies at Harvard University, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Science, Religion, and Culture at the Harvard Divinity School. In 2017, Anna received her PhD from the Department of History at Columbia University, supported by a Mellon CES Dissertation Completion Fellowship from the Council of European Studies and grants from the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service. Her articles and reviews have been published in Contemporary European History, the Dance Research Journal, and the Germanic Review, Literature, Culture, and Theory. She has also written about history, politics, and culture for wider audiences in publications including The Point, Public Books, and Dissent magazine. Prior to her academic career, she danced professionally from 2008 to 2009, and she served as from 2008 to 2009, she also served as film archivist to choreographer Merce Cunningham. She is currently writing a book on politics, culture, and modern dance in Germany from 1900 to 1935. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and please join me in welcoming Anna.
Okay, hi, welcome. Thank you, Kristen, for that lovely introduction. I just want to say, as a point of clarification, social studies is actually a department at Harvard University, and it's not the thing that you took in fifth grade. It's just to let you know, it's an interdisciplinary program in history, anthropology, sociology, and political theory, and I teach history there. First, thank you all so much for being here today. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Great. It's a little bit, there's a term in German for lamp fever, when you have all the spotlights on you. It's a little bit disorienting right now, but I'll get used to it. I think there's probably more people here than show up for distinguished professor lectureships at Oxford, so I'm really honored that you're all here today. The other thing I should say is, unlike many of those lecturers at Oxford who can sort of give an eloquent oratorio for 75 minutes completely off script, I'm not quite there yet in my career. So I will be reading from a script and will go off occasionally. And some of that is also to ensure that I speak slowly, which I know you'll all appreciate. So. Great, without further ado. Oops. Okay, and you have handouts to accompany the talk. And as you'll note on the handout, I've listed some key terms and names in the order that they appear in the lecture. So they're not chronological, though the talk will largely be chronological, just for your reference. Okay. So perhaps one of the first words that comes to mind when one looks at an image by the French painter Henri de Toulouse Lautrec is movement. Or maybe two words, movement and dance. Both because of his subject matter and the quality and curves of his lines and brushstrokes, it's not hard to see how his images literally and metaphorically leap across the page. Across the various periods of his relatively short life and career, Toulouse-Lautrec captured all kinds of bodies in motion. Bodies leaning and swaying, bodies kicking, swinging and lunging, bodies poised, posed, and perching, ready to pounce. Toulouse-Lautrec saw movement everywhere, in the gestures and attitudes of professional dancers, of prostitutes and circus performers, to audience members, men and women on the street. Dance, as many of you know, formed an important context for Toulouse-Lautrec. And as I hope to show you in the next 75 minutes or so, it also offers an important window into understanding his work. Importantly, I hope to show you today how thinking about the history of dance expands our understanding of what we see around us, not just in the particular exhibition that will be here shortly, or in the museum and in the gallery, but as Toulouse Lautrec would have it, on the street and in everyday life. My talk today is structured in two parts. First, I'll take you back in time to the origins of Western theatrical, namely stage dancing, and its development in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So get ready for some time travel. Along the way, I'll touch upon some key moments and ideas in French history, which will help us connect the dancing stage to the rest of the world. In the second part, then, I'll speak more specifically about Toulouse Lautrec, his connection to dance, and specifically his connection to specific dancers in his own contemporary moment. And in this part, I'll talk specifically about the influences of Edgar Degas, who's known, as you know, for depicting dancers. But I'll also speak in more detail about one particular dancer, the American Loïe Fuller, whose Serpentine dance captured both Toulouse Lautrec's and all of Europe's imagination. By looking closely at Fuller's movement, we can begin to see, or speak more precisely, as I hope to show you, about what dance has to say to us and why dance is important. My point in doing all of this today and in structuring it such is I want to show you how the title of my talk, Toulouse-Lautrec's Dancing World, was an integral part of French culture, society, and politics since the Bourbon rule. So it's also through dance that we can see some of the most important features of European history and French history, not just dance history and not just art history, as they come into focus. And then at the end, I'll leave about 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A. And I'll also hang out at the end, so if some of you are kind of shy about speaking in front of so many people, you can come down and talk to me after. The last thing I want to say before I actually dig into the talk itself is a bit of a disclaimer. As you heard from my bio, I'm not an art historian. I'm a European intellectual historian and a historian of dance. So please bear with me if my vocabulary or the way that I talk about visual images is slightly different from what you're used to. And I would say in this situation, you're all the experts on art history here. But I do hope that my perspective, being slightly different, can help you see some new things or think in a different way about some familiar things. So, okay. So arguably, dance is why we know about Toulouse-Lautrec in the first place. His depiction of a dancer in performance is what launched him into fame. One night in December of 1891, 3,000 copies of a poster by the rather young Toulouse-Lautrec were plastered across Paris, which was his first attempt at lithography, no less, advertising performances by can-can dancer La Goulou, in English, the Glutton, at the Montmartre dance hall, the Moulin Rouge. Overnight, Toulouse-Lautrec became a sensation in the art world, and his reputation was sealed. And this was before Instagram. So while the cultural circumstances of Toulouse-Lautrec's sudden rise to fame, namely the prevalence of advertising, the popularity of print media, and the widespread cult of the celebrity, all the focus of the exhibition that will be here shortly, may have been unique to the sort of mid to late 19th century Paris, the popularity, prevalence, and importance of dance was nothing new. In many ways, dance has played a significant role in French culture, society, and politics since the 17th century. And of course, dance has a much longer history than the 17th century, and it's not just concentrated geographically in France, but that is a talk for another day. So today, I'm going to start with Louis XIV, otherwise known as the Sun King, pictured here. Louis ascended the French throne in 1661 at age 13, by which time he was already an accomplished dancer, And his father, Louis XIII, was also, by all accounts, an accomplished dancer himself. So in fact, Louis's nickname, the Sun King, le Roi Soleil, comes from his performance of Apollo in a 1653 ballet, pictured here, the Ballet de la Nuit. So dance for Louis was more than a youthful hobby or a pastime, it was a passion. It was also a powerful political tool. During his reign, which lasted until 1715, he danced in some 40 productions, which is rather a lot. The year of his ascension, he founded the Royal Academy of Dance, which was one of the many academies that he founded during his reign, which was kind of served a dual purpose. On the one hand, these academies brought France a kind of wider international prestige at the time and French influence, but it also helped to centralize his power. So by having academics, professors, artisans, performers, essentially all working underneath him, he could control what they were doing. So, although the academy that he founded closed during the French Revolution, the dance and opera companies that it housed, which are sort of collectively known as the Paris Opera, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and which itself Louis founded only a few years later after the Academy, have in fact survived to this day. So by all accounts, Louis was a skillful dancer, as you can kind of see from his pose here. And in other portraits, as you'll note, he was very proud of his shapely legs. And this is just one of many portraits of Louis that really, I don't know whether it's you see more of his face or his wig or his legs. It's quite impressive and it's quite striking. So at this point you may be asking yourself why you've come to a talk on Toulouse Lautrec, only to hear about a French king who preceded him by 300 years. So the reason why I want to talk about Louis has to do with some of the innovations that he made to stage performance and dance technique, as well as the emphasis he placed on the political role of dance. These innovations, as we'll see, resonated over the centuries and provide an important context for understanding Toulouse-Lautrec's depiction of dance and movement. So the main points. First, under Louis, dance became a stage spectacle. The stage was elevated several inches from the floor so that audiences, for the first time, had to look up to see the performers. In order to further create the effect of a spectacle, stages were equipped with wings, curtains, trapdoors, backstages, backdrops, and machinery. So this meant that audiences could no longer see performers prior to their appearance on stage, further emphasizing aspects of illusion, drama, and surprise to the actual performance itself. So from many respects, the dancer commanded the audience's attention. And I think it's really important to note here how different this was from dance forms that preceded Louis. So prior to him, dance was done quite a bit, but it wasn't separated from the sort of continuum of everyday life or other kinds of courtly activities. So you would have banquets with dancers who would kind of appear in between meals or during meals. They would be competing for a lot of sort of hustle and bustle. Whereas this, you really have a sort of, let's just say, monodirectional attention. You have to look at Louis and you have to look at his shapely legs. But I should also note that we're still kind of a long way off from the sort of convention that we're used to in theater today. As we're here, you're sitting in a darkened house, there's a spotlight on me, the performer. That doesn't really happen until more of the mid-19th century, but we can talk about that later. Nevertheless, the important thing to say about Louis is that he really showed how dance could create new worlds, new scenarios, and new experiences for the audience. So the purpose of dance was to stimulate new emotions and new feelings, new kinds of passions. It no longer meant simply to imitate storylines or copy steps. So I'm sure you can see where I'm heading with all of this. So for the king in particular, this meant that dance formed a very important tool to exercise his political and social power. By placing himself, his body, center stage, Louis could enchant his audience. His movements had the effect of defying ordinary logic and circumstance. Surrounded by elaborate lights and sets, he could display his body as something unusual and, in fact, divine. So many of you may be familiar with the term the divine right of kings, which was the political justification for the king's authority, which people at the time believed was granted to the monarch from God directly. So historically, moreover, the king's actual physical body was understood to be the kind of collective body of the people. So in this sense, and it was a collective body in its sort of most perfect form. So Louis then effectively used dance both literally and symbolically to show off his divine right. His body and his movement demonstrated and asserted the foundation of his power. So his body on stage was symbolic and physiological, flesh and blood. Ballet historian Jennifer Homan notes, and I think this is important also to mention, quote, "Under Louis XIV, dance became much more than a blunt instrument of power. He made it integral to life at court, a symbol and requirement of aristocratic identity, so deeply ingrained and internalized that the art of the ballet would forever be linked to his reign." So dance wasn't just a tool for the king, but it was also a tool for others, namely nobles who were close to him or who aspired to be close to him, to exercise their own social power, still underneath him, but it was a way to kind of social climb, essentially, by being a good dancer. Okay, two more quick things about Louis before I move on. And I really could spend all day talking about him. It's so fascinating. So under Louis, some of the first forms of dance notation also developed. This here is an example of foyer notation by Raoul Auger-Fayet. And again, this is the sort of idea of sealing Louis' legacy, disseminating knowledge, the sort of French influence and prestige. But I show this here also because it's very beautiful, and as art lovers, you can certainly appreciate the intricacies, I think, or the visual intricacy of it. And lastly, it was under Louis, and more specifically his dancing masters that he posted at the Royal Academy, that dance technique became codified as a series of discrete positions that displayed the body to optimize visual line and create a visual illusion of space. So many of you may be familiar with the term turnout in ballet, and here I think you can see it in his feet. They're sort of pointing out diagonally to the sides. So the idea with turnout, both as Louis developed it, and then later as it kind of fully emerges in ballet technique, is that by positioning the body along diagonal lines in a very short amount of space, because stages certainly weren't as large as they are today, the body itself could give a visual illusion of more space, of expanded spatial depth. So this is very important, both because the body, certainly technique becomes the kind of physical coordination of skill and the execution of physical skill, and also the sort of simultaneous display of an expanded spatial area. So while the suggestive kicks of La Goulou were perhaps a far cry from the poise of the Sun King, I think that there's some of the same basic principles can start to emerge. So you can see her standing leg, even though it's in shadow here, is in turnout. Her upper body is facing her audience, and her dance is displaying, among other things, her physical skill and her technique. She inspires passion and fantasy, though in this case, it's largely sexual. and she transports her audience somewhere else. And the fact, and we can also talk later more specifically about the images, but I think the fact that you only see the shadows of her audience around her kind of highlights this idea of her as a sort of center of the stage, commanding presence, the thing that's generating fantasy, certainly. And there's a lot of other things going on in this image as well, which we'll get to. But back to the story. So after Louis, dance received significant attention during the Enlightenment, and many of the most important philosophes of the period, so Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, discussed dance and its role in demonstrating the goodness of human reason, the infinite progress or perfectibility of man, and forms of humanistic education, not which are shown in this image here, which is waiting for me to talk. I just realized. So alongside of the political and literary works of the philosophes, many of them wrote dance scenarios and operas. And just two quick things before I talk about the French Revolution, which you see depicted here. So before the Revolution, around the 1770s, another important innovation took place to stage performance that's relevant for our purposes, which is the development of the divertissement. So this was a short kind of stage number that was arranged around a particular theme, but didn't have necessarily a long or elaborate developed plot line. So divertissement would become very important for stage dance in the 19th century, given that many numbers in these dance halls were effectively divertissement, just short numbers organized around a theme. It was also during this time that some of the major French dancing masters, in particular Jean-Georges Noverre, traveled throughout Europe to Italy, Austria, and Scandinavia, spreading French technique to nobles, royals, and court cultures across the European empires. So I think, again, here we can really start to see the dissemination of, or see the origins of how dance and ballet is so historically tied and associated to the French. Okay. So the French Revolution of 1789 is the next major moment that I'd like to talk about. And again, dance had a very important role to play during the Revolution. And it also led to some important changes in theatrical culture, which resonated in Toulouse Lautrec's day. So it's obviously very hard to understate the modern significance of the French Revolution, and I will spare you the lecture on political history, but I will just say briefly, given the centrality, the physical centrality and the symbolism of the Paris Opera, it in fact featured prominently in many revolutionary spectacles and riots. On July 11th, 1789, for example, which is just 3 days before the storming of the Bastille, which you see pictured here, thousands of people actually approached the Paris Opera attempting to burn it down. And I think it's also very important to note that in spite of all of the sort of, the revolution had been kind of bubbling for a while, and despite all of the sort of political agitation that was going on at the time, the Paris Opera continued to have performances constantly. So it really, I think that the idea that the show must go on is kind of appropriate for that moment. So you have all of these rioters who show up at the doors of the Paris Opera, want to burn it down, but what happens is really interesting. So instead of actually tearing down the theater, when the new Republican government takes control of Paris, it actually takes over the opera as well and doesn't raise its walls. And save a brief period following the arrest of Louis XVI, the king that would be killed, performances actually continued at the opera. So again, the show must go on. And this is, again, the symbol of the monarchy. But now, after the killing of the king, performance and dance at the opera were no longer the lavish spectacles for courtly nobles, but instead became performances for all of the French citizens of the new republic. The first performance at the Paris Opera following the takeover featured a group of women and orphans, and sans-culottes, French revolutionaries, could go to the opera whenever they wanted to for free, or maybe not whenever they wanted to, but occasionally they had free performances for them. And importantly, the content of the performances dealt with revolutionary themes and festivals, projecting the ideals of liberté, égalité, and fraternité through movement and dance. And one example of that is pictured here, which is the Festival of the Supreme Being, which was in 1794. So this is during the Terror now, which took place outside in the street, and you can see there are men and women who are participating in it. And I think this actually took place in front of Notre Dame. I'm not sure. So then after the revolution, and again, these were huge. I mean, tons of people involved and watching. So after the revolution, Napoleon, not surprisingly, took over the opera and more or less restored it to the kind of role it had under the monarchy. This also meant that Napoleon, censored dance and stipulated pretty precisely what was acceptable to put on stage. But it's also important to note that the revolutionaries censored dance as well. And censorship is a very big issue, even up till Toulouse Lautrec's moment. But another important thing that happened during the revolution was that new theaters, smaller venues for performance, popped up across Paris. And although during his reign, Napoleon shut many of these down, I think the precedent was set for a kind of wider theatrical culture that was sort of built into Parisian life. So the next kind of touchstone in this rapid tour through history that I want to talk about happens after Napoleon's reign. This is during the Bourbon Restoration from 1815 to 1830. And this is the rise of the female star, the étoile, the star female dancer. So until the French Revolution, it's also important to note that the major dancers of the day and major sort of figures of the day who danced were men. And many of these men performed roles in travesty, cross-dressing as women. But after the Revolution, it was really women who ruled the show. And throughout the 19th century, women were the sort of dancers of the 19th century, and it's not until you have the rise of ballet in late imperial Russia that the male dancer begins to kind of gain any traction once again. So arguably, the first real prima ballerinas, as we would kind of refer to them today, came from Italy, Austria, and Scandinavia, and not France. And one major figure of the day is Marie Taglioni, who's pictured center. Along with Carlotta Grisi, she was also very well known. I think Taglioni she was of Italian heritage, but I think she was born and raised in Sweden. But thanks to the dissemination of French technique under Louis XIV, she was, like many other ballerinas, French trained. But it was in Paris where Taglioni rose to fame as a dancer and became an international symbol of stardom. Her premiere at the Paris Opera in 1827 caused a sensation. She remained a star throughout the 1930s, and her name, in many ways, is synonymous with Romanticism in ballet. And for those of you ballerines, she's particularly known for her performance in the main role in La Sylphide. Fanny Elsler is another name that you might associate with this time period. In her case, she was known for her leading role in Giselle. And also, as a brief point of reference, I should say, both Giselle and La Sylphide are kind of, when we think about ballet today, those are kind of two main staples. They kind of really define the modern genre. So the important point, and I'll begin to distinguish more specifically modern dance and forms of popular dancing as we kind of move along. But the point that I really want to get across here is that at this moment, these dancers elevated the cultural significance of the female dancer, so the female body on stage. This is something, though, that we'll talk about now on out. It's very questionable whether or not these female bodies enjoyed the same kind of social or political power through dance that, say, someone like Louis XIV did in his moment. Okay, so now we've almost arrived at Toulouse Lautrec's moment. The Second Empire in France, which began under the reign of Napoleon III in 1851, saw the transformation of Paris and the emergence of many of the theaters that Toulouse-Lautrec himself would visit. The Paris Opera remained a center for official or kind of high dancing, you could say, and it continued to be subsidized by the French state. But meanwhile, as a part of the new wave of commercial culture in the 19th century, a range of privately owned variety theaters, café-concerts, cabarets, dance halls, pantomimes, magic shows, circus acts, you name it, cropped up around the city. And these were hugely popular across a broad swath of the French population. And again, this is, I think, really, to my best of my knowledge, the focus of the exhibition that we'll be opening here. But it wasn't just dance that was undergoing a tremendous popularization and transformation at the time. It was artistic expression in painting, music, and literature more broadly. These transformations in the arts were intimately tied with massive transformations in French society, and in particular, changes to urban planning in Paris during the Second Empire. Notably, this was the renovation of Paris, directed under George Eugène Haussmann, so what's known as the Haussmannization of the city, which gave it the very characteristic look that it has today. So effectively, the Paris of today is the Paris of Haussmann. Brought huge changes in architectural style, public works, public parks. Paris got its sewer and sanitation system kind of up and running. But I think most significantly, as you can see on this Pissarro painting, the grand boulevards that are so characteristic of much of the city were all built during this period. And I should also say the current Paris Opera is housed in the Palais Garnier, and that was also built and designed by Haussmann, I think. It's important to note that Haussmannization displaced thousands of Parisian citizens. The physical transformation of the city coincided with a population surge at the time, so people moving from sort of rural areas into urban centers, and that happened kind of all over Europe at this time, particularly in Paris. And the combination of the two led to new forms of urban poverty, overcrowding, homelessness, public health disasters. It's really quite tragic in a lot of ways. And for those of you that are interested in the Haussmannization of Paris and this kind of time period, I'm pretty sure Émile Zola, in his Rouge en Mocourt series of novels, writes about much of life at this time. Some Parisians saw the changes around them as an opportunity to expand the range of artistic possibility. In 1863, for example, the poet Charles Baudelaire called his fellow artists to arms and encouraged modern artists to immerse themselves in the crowds of the boulevard or the arcades, to embrace rather than flee from the changes of social, technological, and cultural modernity. By doing this, he argued, the artist would become, quote, a kaleidoscope gifted with consciousness, responding to each one of the movements of the crowd and reproducing the multiplicity of life and the flickering grace of all of the elements of life. I really love this passage because I think it captures very well that sort of distorted or funhouse feel that you have when you look at a Toulouse Lautrec painting, for example. This idea of we see the world as if we were a kaleidoscope gifted with consciousness. For Baudelaire, as for many of his contemporaries, this also meant a new attention to, and I think at times quite problematic attention, to the vulgar, the gritty, the depraved, and the decadent. For Baudelaire, Toulouse-Lautrec, and many others, no place or subject matter could escape the true artist's attention. The street, the cafe, the brothel, the arcade, sublime beauty, effervescent life, the latest fashions mixed up with mental illness, alcoholism, poverty, perversion, addiction. For Baudelaire and the symbolist poets in particular, and here I'm thinking about Mallarmé, Rimbaud, Verlaine, the goal was to expose the hypocrisy of aristocratic culture and values, and to champion forms of human imagination, and I would also say resilience and creativity, over tradition, rationalization, and technology. So one of Baudelaire's contemporaries and an important forerunner to Toulouse-Lautrec, Edgar Degas, author of the painting that you've been looking at, took a similar but different approach. So I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about Degas. As I'm sure you're aware, Degas' canvases offer one of the most important visual windows into the world of dance during the first few decades of the Third Republic. So this begins around 1870. It goes until, well, the Third Republic goes until 1940, but I'm really talking just about the turn of the century here. These canvases offer us crucial clues about particular dances, as well as the social conditions of dancers and the theatrical culture of adoration, voyeurism, and solicitation that was intimately tied to stage performance. Again, as many of you know, Degas was an important influence on Toulouse-Lautrec, and Degas' studio, in fact, was located in Montmartre, which was the neighborhood that I think is most closely associated with Toulouse-Lautrec. That was the home of the Moulin Rouge and many other cabarets. So I think it's easy to look at Degas' depictions of dancers and see graceful, elegant bodies. This is a quite famous one. Again, you can see her turnout in her legs, just like Louis. But if we look a bit closer at Degas' works, we also see images of poverty, desperation, and disempowerment hidden in the wings. Many of the young girls depicted in his paintings and in his prints engaged or were forced, coerced, or had no choice but to resort to socially sanctioned forms of prostitution. Bourgeois or upper middle class theater goers, who were largely men, would often identify favorite dancers, lavishing gifts, attention, and money on them. While sexual availability was not always a requirement, it was often expected, or it was the norm. And here you can see two dancers conversing with admirers backstage. Young female dancers in particular, such as this little dancer aged 14, were known colloquially as petits rats, or little rats. And this was probably, I don't know, have any of you heard this term before? Yeah? Some? No? Ish? Okay. So for those of you that were not familiar with the term petit rat, that was probably not what you were thinking a minute ago when I first showed you this slide. I also think there's some significant irony here, just to say, and this is also, I think, the case holds for Toulouse-Lautrec, because some of these images are so iconic. The irony being the image of a petit rat and some of these other dancers graces the cover of many a museum gift shop handbag or umbrella or thank you card. So just something to keep in mind. Anyway, So I guess my point in saying all of this is just to kind of give us a much more complicated picture of what the exercise of social power looked like in dance, or looks like in dance. And arguably, many of these girls, who, it should be noted, were very talented, they were very hardworking, they were very devoted to dance, were also able to gain significant income and support themselves and oftentimes their families financially through their work. And I use the term work here to refer to their dancing work and also to their sex work. On the other hand, they were often the constant object of male gaze and scrutiny. So I guess the point really of saying this too is that Degas had a social critique that was no less pointed than Baudelaire's. It just took a different form, and that form was dance. And as a result, we can ask a series of questions that I want us to keep in mind for the rest of the talk. And keep it in mind when you visit a Degas painting, because you will see many Degas paintings again, I'm sure. Are the dancers the objects of Degas' gaze, as well as the theatergoers that he depicts? Is he complicit in the commodification or exploitation of these bodies? Is he sympathetic? Or does he have a sort of more ambiguous or neutral eye and is simply capturing what he saw around him? I'm not going to answer these questions for you. I'll leave them up to you to think about next time you find yourself in front of a Degas. But one thing that you might want to keep in mind as you're thinking about these questions is to look for clues in terms of how Degas depicts movement and dance. So what kinds of gestures or poses are the dancers in? Are these poses or gestures physically demanding? Just imagine yourself trying to do them and sort of think about what that might require. Do they suggest boredom, exhaustion, or ennui? Skill and technique? Based on the dancer's spatial orientation, as well as the sort of visual perspective that Degas gives us, what sides or surfaces of their bodies are available to us to see? What sides or surfaces are visible? What, in other words, does dance direct us to see here? And again, I'm not going to answer these questions, but I'll leave them up to you. Okay, so with this in mind, let's take a look now at Toulouse Lautrec. Okay, so as I hope has become clear by now, dance was an integral part of French culture for centuries, and it was a hugely popular form of entertainment in the fin-de-siècle cultural milieu that Toulouse-Lautrec found himself in. Dance was the hallmark of many of the privately owned Montmartre cabaret and haunts, like the Moulin Rouge, pictured here. And also, this is inside the Moulin Rouge. The Chat Noir. This is not by Toulouse-Lautrec, but it's a quite iconic image. This is also the Chat Noir. This was taken from the third location, which was also in Montmartre. So this is not exactly the same interior, but I think it gives you the sense of actually how small these places were. And then some of the other smaller or lesser known, not lesser known, but less famous, let's just say café-concerts, such as Le Merliton and the Moulin de la Galette. And Toulouse-Lautrec also did a lot of prints and posters for Le Merliton, which I imagine will be talked about in the exhibition. So, like Toulouse-Lautrec's career, the lifespan of some of these performance venues was actually quite short. Le Chat Noir and Le Merliton, for example, opened in 1882 and 85 respectively, both closed in 1897. So in many ways, I think, Toulouse-Lautrec's images capture well the frenzy, energy, and fanfare of a cultural moment that could not be anything but short-lived. It was ephemeral, like dance. Dancers, and we'll return again to this image, were also of particular interest to Toulouse-Lautrec. So while Degas had painted scores of different dancers, Toulouse-Lautrec focused on a few figures in particular. So here we have Lagoulou, and following his rise to fame with his poster for the Moulin Rouge, Toulouse-Lautrec was drawn to render particular stars who were both, well, let's just say he was drawn to render particular women who were both well-known and unknown alike. So Lagoulou was a Parisian celebrity. We see her here. We see her here in the center. This is her with her sister. Interesting. He also depicted the singer and performer Yvette Gilbert, who was very well known. And also famously, the can-can dancer Jane Avril. Importantly, Toulouse-Lautrec got to know many of these dancers personally. And as you can see from the portrait of Avril here, he often depicted these women, and they were largely women, as more than simply bodies on stage. Avril, in particular, was a friend of his. In contrast to many of the stage performers at the time, Jane Avril was well educated, and she was also friends with many avant-garde artists and writers in addition to Toulouse-Lautrec. Interestingly, she was also a patient of Jean-Martin Charcot, who was the director of the famous Salpêtrière Hospital. And Charcot was known for staging public demonstrations at the time of his experimental treatment, which was largely based around hypnosis, of his female, and they were all female, mental health patients. Many of these women, as you can see from the images here, were subsequently photographed or drawn in dramatic, dynamic poses that they would strike during their hypnosis. Art historian Richard Thompson has argued that Jane Avril's connection to Charcot possibly influenced Toulouse-Lautrec, leading him to depict her with more psychological depth or suggestiveness than his other subjects. So again, here just to kind of put the poses together, though I'm not sure if Avril was actually subjected to hypnosis officially, but I think that the important thing, both here and in the first portrait I showed you, here, is that Toulouse-Lautrec is really emphasizing, certainly in this painting, Avril's gaze, her mind. I mean, her body is completely cloaked, right? We don't see the lower half of her body, and what we do see is covered up in her cape. And then here, I think what's interesting about this, I mean, certainly there's a serpent climbing up her body, which is interesting, but that you kind of have the sense, given her dress, that she's sort of bounded somehow. So I don't know, again, I think there's a lot of conclusions that we could draw from it. So importantly, Toulouse-Lautrec, like Degas, was a close observer of his subjects, which often meant that he frequently attended dance performances. This meant many dance performances. For example, in the city's more reputable Théâtre des Variétés, which was located in central Paris, Toulouse-Lautrec attended 20 performances by the famed dancer-actress Marcel Lender, pictured here. Also, he could capture the final fleeting moments of her bolero in oil. So I think it's probably safe to say that after seeing 20 performances of the same thing, he probably knew the dance as well as the dancer. And I think he captures it quite well here. In contrast to some of his more famous subjects, other dancers like British entertainer May Belfort, here, and May Milton, pictured here, were virtually unknown before they were captured in Toulouse Lautrec's prints. So he actually launched them into fame. Okay. And here I think we can really see how Toulouse-Lautrec played a central part in the burgeoning celebrity culture, or the cult of the celebrity, of both turn-of-the-century Paris, and it's certainly a phenomenon that we all know very well today. But perhaps the most well-known of Toulouse-Lautrec's dancing subjects, the American Loïe Fuller, gave rise to the most curious of all of Toulouse-Lautrec's works. Yes. I'm only going to show you two, but this is actually a series of 50 lithographs that he did of her, which I'll talk about in a minute. Fuller, interestingly, was one of the few dancing subjects that Toulouse-Lautrec had no personal relationship with. But before I talk about his connection to her and these images, I want to say a little bit about her biography because she's a really interesting figure. Born Mary Louise Fuller, the Illinois native Loïe Fuller is one of the pioneers of what is known as expressive dancing around the turn of the 20th century. So expressive dancing included short, non-narrative solo stage works that experimented with physical movement vocabularies, visual effect, and musicality. Other important female soloists in this movement, and again, they're largely female soloists that are pioneers in this movement, included the Austrians Greta and Else Wiesenthal, otherwise known as the Wiesenthal sisters, Americans Ruth St. Denis, and Isadora Duncan, who's pictured here. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with Isadora Duncan, who's considered to be one of the founders of modern dance. And I should also say, I think it's interesting, so I do a bit of research on Duncan, and whenever I mention her name to my peers, they have no idea who I'm talking about. However, whenever I mention her name to my mom's friends, they know immediately who I'm talking about because of the 1968 Vanessa Redgrave film, which I'm sure many of you have seen. Yes, Duncan, I will just say, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Duncan and Fuller in a minute and the differences between what they were doing, but Duncan actually got her professional start as a member of Loïe Fuller's dance company, touring, and she toured Europe very briefly with Fuller from 1901 to 1902. So Fuller was a pioneer of a particular style of expressive dance known as Serpentine Dancing. And this kind of dance combined costume, lighting, and visual effects to alter the form and appearance of the human body. Dressed in reams of fabric attached to metal poles, Fuller would dance surrounded by swirls of fabric. This earned her the name of the human butterfly, the luminous fairy, la fée lumineuse, and also la fée électrique, or the electric fairy. And I'll talk about that in a second. Her performances in the United States were an instant success. They were so successful, in fact, that Fuller was plagued from the beginning of her career by a host of imitators and copycats. Understandably frustrated, Fuller filed one of the first cases of copyright law involving dance, Fuller versus Bemis, which unfortunately, for Fuller, ruled against her, arguing that and the judge argued that copyright law did not extend to cover, quote, the devising of a series of graceful movements, end quote, since it did not amount to a dramatic composition, which would have been covered by copyright law. And it actually wasn't until a case in the 1970s that dance finally was covered by copyright law. So I think Fuller was very ahead of the curve here. So understandably, even more frustrated, Fuller leaves the US for Europe. And in 1892, she was hired by Paris's largest theater at the time, the Folies Bergère, to perform several of her Serpentine dances. And again, this is a Charest poster. This is not Toulouse Lautrec. But, like Toulouse Lautrec's advertisements and posters of La Goulue, these images of Loïe Fuller were similarly plastered all over Paris. Here's this one, and then here's another one. And I'll talk now, I think one of the more striking, well, there's a few things that are striking about this. One, Fuller is much more, let's say, of a sex pot here than I think she was in real life. And this really kind of sells her in a particular way. But what is important about this, and I'll talk about this right now, is the color, as you see. So, importantly, the Folies Bergère, right in 1892, and right when Fuller arrives, had just switched from gas lighting to electrical lighting. So actually it was electrical stage lighting. So this meant that the house, the theater house, so what you're all sitting in, was still lit by gas lamps, but everything that happened on stage had electrical lighting. Before Fuller's performances, the ushers in the audience, when everybody sat down, and then all the ushers would go and snuff out every single one of the gas lamps before the show could start. And if you read historical accounts of the time, I guess it took a while, so it would mean that while everyone was kind of waiting for Fuller to come on stage, the level of anticipation and excitement just kind of grew and grew as each gas lamp got snuffed out, and then Fuller would emerge. So in many ways, her art was really not possible had her arrival not coincided so precisely with this changeover in theater technology. So she was a sensation in Paris, and in addition to performing at the Folies Bergère, she was featured prominently in the 1900 World Exhibition in Paris, which showcased, among other things, new forms of technology, industry. The latest trends in Art Deco was unveiled at this time. And there are several posters of the Universal Exhibition that have this sort of classic Art Deco sort of font and design with Fuller on them as well. I'm sorry, I don't have any to show you here. And this is the entrance to the Universal Exhibition in Paris in 1900. This is by René Bonnet, the architect. And you can see all the little dots along the facade were all individual electric bulbs. So at night, it was really quite a spectacle to walk through this archway. And Duncan actually visited this exhibition as well, and she writes in her memoirs about walking through the gates. And 1889, I should also just say, this is also from the 1900 exhibition, but 1889 was when the Eiffel Tower was unveiled. Dance historian and Loïe Fuller biographer Anne Cooper Albright notes how intimately tied Fuller's dance was with key cultural and social trends of this period, which is also known as the Belle Époque. And I'm going to read a short quote. One of the characteristics of the so-called Belle Époque was the increasingly conscious and deliberate performance of the fashionable self, the performance of seeing and being seen, in the avenues of the Bois de Boulogne as well as the Champs-Élysées. One aspect of the phantasmagoric that prevailed at the end of the century was a slippage of performance outside the previously prescribed theatrical venues. So life, in other words, was a performance thanks to the spectacular effects of light and shadow and kaleidoscopic colors. And I think you can really, if you just put yourself, and I'm pretty sure that the lights here were also colored, the light bulbs. It's easy to imagine walking through this archway at night and feeling like you were in a show or you were part of some kind of spectacle and that you were a character kind of in this magical world. And I think certainly this idea, this phantasmagoria, we can see in Toulouse-Lautrec's images. I think we can also think about this sort of idea of the transformation of the self if we imagine Fuller's dances. So waves of fabric swirling, masking and revealing herself and her body, which would then be unveiled or revealed in new positions or poses. And just to give you a sort of fuller idea of what her performances look like, that was not intentional. One of her most famous performances, which Toulouse-Lautrec did not see, was called The Dance of Fire from 1895, where she performed on top of a glass plate that was inserted into the stage floor, and which was then lit from underneath. So she would swirl the fabric with these lights from underneath. The music was Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. It's just like totally bizarre. Really dramatic, but by all accounts, Fuller actually appeared as if she was on fire. And I should say here that, well, two things. Fuller's just really incredible innovations required an incredible amount of physical strength because, again, these were not, short, or these were not long skirts. They were draperies. These were huge amounts of fabric that she was waving around. So it required an incredible amount of certainly upper body strength to do this. And then also just to say, I mean, this is theater in the days before walkie-talkies and wireless communication. So given that her dancing required so much coordination from stagehands and theater technicians, which I should say is not necessarily represented here given she's dancing outside, but the coordination between the theater hands was tremendous, and they were doing this all without, again, walkie-talkies. And so those of you that have been involved in theater, I mean, to have a tech rehearsal, it's hours and hours. So this is all without that kind of instant communication. So a quick note just about some of the differences between Loïe Fuller and Isadora Duncan, because I think it's rather interesting. While they're both, I would say, founders of this movement of expressive dancing, they kind of part ways. And Duncan is associated more with modern dance. So Fuller's work really relies heavily on technology and would not have been possible had stage technology been what it was at the time. Duncan, however, did not use technology at all in her works. She was barefoot, she was wearing a simple toga, she showed off her bare legs, much to the sort of it was a scandal for many of the sort of more upper-class audiences that she performed for. So Duncan was very closely associated with the natural world. In her performances and in her lectures, she very much identified herself as a reproducer, very much tied to her identity as a mother of several children who tragically died in a car accident in Paris. But another thing that was very important, and this is, I think, gets to sort of interesting comparison between the two women, Duncan talks a lot about how her dance is about the outward expression of a kind of inner state that she's feeling. So it could be an emotional state, a kind of biological or natural state, a sort of spiritual state, that through dance she expresses to her audience. And here I very much think about Kandinsky, and sort of expressionism in art, that art is the outward expression of an inner state. In any event, I think both Fuller and Duncan were mediums, we could say, for sort of invisible forces. So for Fuller, it was a kind of electricity and color. For mediums, for forces, and for Duncan, a kind of inner force that relied on dance and the dancer to reveal, right? So, back to Toulouse-Lautrec. In contrast to Toulouse-Lautrec's other dancing subjects, Toulouse-Lautrec did not know Fuller personally, And this may have been due to the fact that Fuller was performing at the Folies Bergère, which was sort of more upscale compared to the sort of seedy haunts of Montmartre, like the Moulin Rouge, that Toulouse Lautrec was more associated with. So after seeing Fuller, Toulouse Lautrec created a series of these 50 lithographs, which I think are currently housed at the BNF, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in a single leather-bound volume. And these images are important not only because they're just interesting to look at, but because they offer important clues for dance historians and for all of us to understand what Fuller's dancing looked like at the time. In this series, just to talk more specifically about the images, Fuller's outline remains the same for all of them. It's a print. But each print is hand-colored differently. So he hand-painted, Toulouse-Lautrec hand-painted combinations of colors for each print, dusting them afterward with silver, bronze, or gold, which created a kind of shimmering effect. And I think sort of capturing, again, the feel of mobility, the play of light of Fuller's dance. So, before I conclude, I want to tease out a few points in light of what we know about French dance history and kind of bring all the pieces of the talk together. So first, I think Fuller clearly captures many of the same elements of illusion, enchantment, and spectacle that were inaugurated under Louis XIV. Her presence on stage clearly commanded attention, clearly stimulated her viewers to experience new emotions, new passions, new sensations. Second, while Fuller clearly fit within the model of the star female dancer and the sort of cult of the celebrity, I would argue that she significantly altered its meaning and performance. While La Goulou's stardom arose in part because of her occasional tendency to forget her underpants during her can-can numbers, Fuller, on the other hand, Fuller's stardom emerged from her movement in the opposite direction, to envelop her physical body in reams and reams of fabric. So while La Goulou sexualized her body to heighten a sense of illusion and fantasy, Fuller effectively, I think, desexualized hers. And I think it's interesting, actually, I found this just as I was coming over here this morning. So Fuller performed in Boston in 1896. And there's a rather interesting review of the performance. And the author of this review, which was, the performance was at the Boston Theater, says that Fuller's performance showed, quote, perfection of every detail. It leaves nothing whatsoever to be desired. So I think, again, striking contrast. At the same time, I think you could argue that the effect was the same. Fuller and La Goulou both commanded attention through their movement, and in doing so, they used dance as a tool to gain social power, fame, celebrity, money. Okay, so just to close, I want to talk a little bit about this image, or these images, and ask some questions. What exactly does Fuller's movement tell us here? What is Toulouse-Lautrec, asking us to see, and how is he using movement to guide us there? Ordinarily, I wouldn't answer my own question, and I would leave it up to you, and we'd talk together and work it out, but I think our numbers prevent that from happening in an easy way. So I'll give you my take, and then I'd love to hear yours after. So there's a couple of striking things about these images. The first being we can't actually see Fuller's body. We can only see her head and her feet. Her face is barely discernible, with only the smallest lines denoting her eyes and mouth. Her feet are barely visible from beneath her costume, but we can see them, and they are in parallel position. So interestingly, in contrast to Louis XIV, who used turnouts of his legs and his feet to create the illusion of spatial depth or expansion, Fuller, like many other dancers, like Duncan, like Isadora Duncan, experimented with dynamic motion and gesture to physically explore the space around her. So while Louis's physical presence and his power, his political power, extends symbolically or suggestively into space through dance, Fuller and Duncan are actually enveloping the space around them. So Duncan is skipping across the stage, she's running, she's leaping, she's, falling. Fuller is waving her arms, and her arms are extended feet beyond her because of this fabric. Like actually, physically. Another striking thing here, we can sort of see the stage, the kind of drop off of the stage, but for the most part, it's a completely flat plane. And some of this is because of Toulouse-Lautrec's choice to do this as a print, but there's not even an attempt to create any sort of spatial depth in the image. So why? Leave that to hang. But I think the last thing I want to say is what's most astonishing in my view about this image is that with Fuller, we have no sense of her body's anatomy, of its structure, of its physical appearance. So contrast this image, for example, with the poster for the Folies Bergère that gives her a kind of Barbie-like body. But here, one could almost say that she has no body at all. It's just disappeared completely in the swirl of fabric, in the swirl of her movement. So Fuller, in other words, is not dancing. She is the dance. So with this, I just want to finish up with a series of questions, which I just, you can think about when you come back and see the exhibition. When we look at these dancing female stars of Paris, what is Toulouse-Lautrec directing us to see? Are we voyeurs, along with him, into a fleshy world of pleasure, illusion, consumption, and escapism? Are we, like Toulouse-Lautrec, witnessing life as it happened and was experienced on the ground? I think Toulouse-Lautrec's depiction of Fuller would kind of run up against some of this. Does his depiction of dance, in other words, transform the fin-de-siècle phantasmagoria of Paris into something we can here and now feel in our own bones? Does he turn it into something disembodied and disorienting? Dematerialized? Does his work bring us closer to the lived experiences of others? Or does it distance us from it by defamiliarizing what is arguably the most familiar thing of all, the physical body in motion? Thank you. Excuse me. So I think there are a few minutes for questions, and the ushers have microphones. So if you could just wait to ask your question until there's a mic, and maybe we could just wait a second until folks who do need to take off. And I'll try my best to answer your questions. Yeah. Okay, yeah, hi.
Hi, thank you. Do we know anything about how the series of 50 lithographs were financed and came to be?
I don't. It didn't come up in any of the question was about financing the prints. Personally, I don't. It didn't come up in any of the accounts either of Toulouse-Lautrec or of Fuller that I read. So, yeah, I'm sorry I can't answer. It's a great question. Yeah, you back there?
First of all...
Oh, sorry, sir, there's a woman a few rows back, and then we can get the mic.
Sure. Thanks very much for fascinating, eye-opening view of what was going on in the dance world and how it was affected by the social aspects. So I also was wondering whether these lithographs, whether the material was, whether the shape was the same and the colors were different, or whether those shapes also changed in the 50 lithographs.
Sure. The shape was the same. The shape was the same in all 50. The color was different. So he experimented from print to print with the colors. And I'm sorry I only have 2 to show you. I've only seen a handful of them reproduced. But yeah, the shape is consistent in all of them. Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah.
Are your comments regarding the prevalence of prostitution among the dancers equally applicable to the cabaret dancers and the ballet dancers?
Sure. Yeah, so the ballet dancers of the 19th century that I was talking about, absolutely, and then certainly with the can-can dancers, yes. I think it seemed, from all the accounts that I've read, pretty similarly kind of divided. Dancers would have admirers. Sexual availability, again, was not always required of them, but was the norm. But Toulouse Lautrec also did a number of series of prostitutes in brothels. So he was also very interested in prostitution because it was also such a big part of the cultural fabric of the Montmartre district as well. So yes, the dancers were also involved in prostitution. I don't think, just to say, I don't know, I can't speak specifically to the La Goulou, Yvette Gilbert, or Jane Avril. So I don't know about the dancers that he specifically depicted. Other questions?
This poster looks very expressive and a little bit abstract even. What other painters at this time are kind of picking up the torch, not necessarily of dancers, but what would you consider this kind of the transition into that next phase of art?
Sure, of expressionism. I mean, and again, I'm certainly not an art historian, but I guess the question that I would ask you is sort of, when you say abstract, what do you mean? A sort of attention to kind of more geometric forms? I mean, one could argue that that's coming out in work by Cézanne, for example, at this time, but, then later, I mean, I know the German case much better, so certainly expressionists associated with the Blue Rider, Kandinsky, again later, but Kandinsky's work obviously looks very different from this, but I think it just depends on how you're defining abstraction, if that makes sense. But yes, this is very much part of, Toulouse-Lautrec, I should also say, he was very tapped into the kind of social world of painters in turn-of-the-century France, so he saw what was going on around him as well, so, yeah.
Do you know where the Paris Opera was located at the time of the French Revolution?
I don't. Do you? Okay. I was wondering if that was a trick question. I unfortunately do not know the original location, but it's a great question. Yeah. Other questions? Well, I'll be here for a few minutes, so if any of you want to come up, please do. Thank you.